Welcome back to 1834, it's match 4, game number 2. Today's guest commentator hasn't arrived yet, so let's just begin. d4 from Bourdonnais, d5, c4, and offering a queen's gambit. All gentlemen must accept a gambit, so McDonnell accepts. e3, e5, the bishop captures the pawn, and the pawns exchange in the centre. We last saw these opening moves in match 3, game number 11, so that's why I'm going through them quite quickly. Knight to f6 now, and knight to c3, bishop to d6, knight to f3, castles from McDonnell, h3 from Bourdonnais, and bringing out the other knight, McDonnell, and castling. And McDonnell goes for h6. Now back in match 3, game number 11, Bourdonnais went for a3, and then we had bishop to f5, Bourdonnais pushed his pawn to g4, and McDonnell sacrificed his horse on g4. And McDonnell went on to win that game within 30 moves. So Bourdonnais decides to try something different this time. Instead of the pawn move, he develops his queen to d3, and we have a completely new game in this series. So McDonnell plays on with knight to a5, attacking the bishop. So Bourdonnais pushes his bishop up to b5, but McDonnell just chases it away. It goes back to a4, and McDonnell starts pushing his pawns, c5. The bishop comes down to c2, lining up against the king in the corner, although this square is defended by the knight. And McDonnell defends by pushing his pawn another square to c4. This attacks the queen, so the queen goes back to e2, and he continues pushing pawns, b5. Knight to e4 now from Bourdonnais. It's attacking both the bishop and the knight here, but for now McDonnell ignores it and develops his own bishop to b7 on this nice diagonal. Capturing the d6 bishop with the knight would be a good move for Bourdonnais, but instead of this he develops his dark square bishop to d2, and McDonnell manages to find a little bit of an advantage here. So how does he do this? Well, first he captures the knight in the centre, the light square bishop captures it back, and then McDonnell brings his rook across to e8, and suddenly Bourdonnais has a lot of pressure to deal with along the open e-file. So Bourdonnais plays on, he brings his knight to e5, and McDonnell captures, the pawn captures back, and McDonnell captures the light square bishop now. And Bourdonnais continues with not capturing with the queen here, but capturing the knight on the edge with the bishop. And here, to retain his advantage, McDonnell should capture the bishop with the queen, and then after the queen captures the central bishop, bring the queen to d2. McDonnell is able to work with his queenside pawn majority. But instead of this queen captures the bishop move, instead, McDonnell brings his queen to d5, defending the bishop and eyeing up the pawn in front of the king. But the game is even again from this point. And our guest commentator has arrived. It's the old Anglo-Saxon English king, Ethelred the Unready, better late than never. Bourdonnais continues the game with f4, revealing the defense of the queen on the g-pawn. So McDonnell goes for a rook lift. He's maybe hoping to bring it across and add more pressure to the g-pawn. And Bourdonnais brings his own rook across to chase away the queen, and the queen retreats to safety on c6. We now have rook to f2 from Bourdonnais, adding more defense to the pawn, and McDonnell doubles up his rooks. We now have bishop back to c3 from Bourdonnais, trying to help with the defense on the central pawn. And from this point, a nice move from McDonnell would be bishop to d3. But instead, he plays f5, which is a massive blunder. Now, Ethelred forgot his notes, so I'll take you through it. Bourdonnais just needs to capture en passant to gain a big advantage. He's got the pawn backed up by the nicely placed bishop, and he's also got the option of the queen coming to g4 and causing lots of trouble for the king. McDonnell's best idea here is actually to give up the exchange by capturing with the rook, and after that, Bourdonnais is in a winning position. However, maybe Bourdonnais wants to keep his passed pawn, or maybe he just forgot how the en passant rule works. It happens to the best of us, and instead of capturing, he plays his king to h2, and the game is even again. The game continues with McDonnell bringing his king to h7, and Bourdonnais starts pushing his pawns on the king side with g4, g6, and queen to e3. Now here, McDonnell goes for bishop to d3 on the end of the pawn chain, and Bourdonnais brings his rook across to g2. The bishop comes back, and now he's got a double attack on the rook next to the king, so the rook moves up to g3. And it's just a little bit of a shuffling of the rooks and the queens going on here, so we'll just go through these. Queen back to c7, rook up to d4, and now rook across to f8, and the central rook comes to d6. Maybe he should have just come here directly instead of the intermediate visit of the d4 square, but hey, it is what it is. We have now rook back to e8 and queen to d4, and the rook advances to e7. Now maybe labourdonnais should think about securing his queen side with a3, but he is intent on attack, so he pushes h4 instead. And it turns out to be alright for him, because McDonnell immediately plays a massive blunder, bishop to d3 again. And the issue with this is that it's under attack from the rook, and I'll show you why this is a problem in a couple of moves. First of all, labourdonnais plays h5, and McDonnell captures the g-pawn. Now, here is the problem. Labourdonnais has rook captures the bishop, and then after the pawn captures the rook, he is able to capture the pawn with the queen and then line up a pin on the king along with this pawn here and the threat of the rook coming across. So it's an awful lot of pressure on the king, and this would give labourdonnais a winning advantage. But he doesn't spot it. He doesn't capture the bishop. Instead, he captures the pawn on g6 with check, which gives McDonnell a passed pawn. And it's all even again. McDonnell captures the pawn with his bishop, getting rid of the check, and the rook captures the g-pawn. The bishop comes back to f5 to threaten the rook, so the rook retreats to g2, and McDonnell brings his queen across to b7 on the nice light square diagonal here. We have a rook exchange on e6, and labourdonnais brings his rook across to d2. He's probably eyeing up this square, hoping to get along the 7th rank, attacking the king. So McDonnell brings his queen across to f7 to head it off. He can now interpose the rook should the queen come in. And now we have king to g1. And in this position, actually bringing the rook across to g2 would be good, but we have king to g1. And this gives McDonnell the chance to bring his rook across to g6 with a check. And now we have rook to g1. So like Ethelred, better late than never. And we have bishop to h3 now from McDonnell, and there is a double attack on the white rook. So to get out of this, labourdonnais just captures the rook, the queen captures back with a check, and now labourdonnais' king is going to head across to the other side of the board to try to find some cover. A bit like Ethelred when he ran away to Normandy in 1013. So king to f2, the queen comes down for a check. We have the king moving to e1, queen to h1, again check, king to d2, bishop to g4, just preparing. The king keeps running, king to c2, and queen to g2, again with check. Bishop to d2 blocking now, so he's managed to find some cover, and McDonnell starts pushing pawns, a5, with his queenside majority. He needs to watch out, though, for the passed central pawns. He does have a passed pawn on the wing, but that's looking a little bit less dangerous than these centre white pawns. We continue with a3 from labourdonnais, and we have bishop to f5 with check now, and the king moves to c3. Queen to e3, again with check, but labourdonnais just blocks it and offers the queen exchange. And here, McDonnell refuses the exchange and brings his queen back to d5. Now McDonnell has run out of checks, and it's labourdonnais' turn. Queen to a7 with check along the 7th rank. He needs to watch out a little bit because there is a checkmate threat from the black queen here coming to d3, but for now it is check, so the king has to move. He checks again, and the black king has a choice. Does he come forward to h5, or does he go back and keep in front of the pawns? Well, the correct choice would be to go forward, because there's an issue if you go back. McDonnell decides to go back, and this is a huge mistake. Labourdonnais is able to come in to f6 and give a check, so the king would need to retreat, and he loses the bishop. And this also protects the checkmating square here, so it's all good for labourdonnais. In fact, Ethelred suggests bribing the Frenchman, but McDonnell wants to fight it out like a man, not kick the can down the road, and quite right too, because labourdonnais doesn't go for this. He is still worried about the checkmate threat here, and perhaps he doesn't notice that the queen will end up defending it, and he throws away the advantage by checking again, and the game is even once more. We now have bishop blocking on d7, and you still need to watch out for this checkmate threat, so labourdonnais backs off his king to c2. We have queen coming in to d3, checking again. King goes to c1 now, it can escape, and McDonnell starts pushing his pawns again, a4. Bishop to e1, hoping to cover some of the squares on the wing to stop the pawn advancing, but this undefends the backwards white pawn, and the queen moves to attack it. The white queen comes to defend on f2 whilst offering more protection to the squares on the wing, but the black queen comes to g4, hoping to assist the pawn across. Labourdonnais brings his king back into the action, king to d2, and McDonnell just pushes his pawn. We have king to e3, and now both kings advancing, king to g6. We have queen to c2 with check along the diagonal here, and McDonnell blocks with the bishop whilst returning the attack on the queen. The queen comes across to e2, offering a queen exchange here, but McDonnell doesn't want to accept straight away. He brings his queen down to g1 with a check, and labourdonnais puts his queen in the way again, offering the queen exchange, and McDonnell accepts. Now, should labourdonnais take back with the king or with the bishop? Ethelred's not ready to help out. He's bleating on about striking back against the Danes and reclaiming his throne, so let's figure this out for ourselves. Well, the bishop has to stay on this diagonal here to defend against the pawn. So if the bishop, for example, captures, then we have b4, pawn captures pawn, and the c-pawn advances. If the pawn captures, for example, this a-pawn is going to queen way before the white pawns, and McDonnell is going to win. The bishop can't help because it's moved off of this diagonal. So let's go back. It's going to be better to capture with the king. However, this also has a problem. It blocks the bishop from defending the h4 square and allows the black pawn to advance, which it does. So now McDonnell has the advantage and we play on. The king moves to f3, revealing the attack on the pawn, so the king moves to defend. And from this point, labourdonnais' king is going to be very busy trying to keep an eye on this wing pawn, because the bishop is only attacking it while it's on h4 and it doesn't have quick access to the h2 square. It needs to be over on the queen side defending the queen side black pawn majority. So yeah, the white king is going to be very busy. McDonnell's plan is going to be to infiltrate with the black king and come all the way across the board to b3 and harass the white pawns over here. So let's see how this plays out. First of all, we have a bishop to d2, and then bishop to e6, just keeping an eye on the white pawns here. And now the white king has to go to g2 to stop the pawn advancing. And this allows the black king to infiltrate to g4, and we just have a waiting move now from labourdonnais. Bishop to c1, h3 with check, and the king moves back to h2, or moves aside to h2. King to f3, continuing to infiltrate. He's still heading towards the left side of the board. Bishop to d2, trying to keep an eye on things, but not doing such a great job at it. King to e2, bishop up to c3, and now king to d3. King to g3, keeping an eye on the pawn still. It can't advance without getting captured. And the king comes into c2, king to h2, and the king finally makes it to b3. Labourdonnais plays his king to g3 because there's not very much else that he can do. And at last, King Ethelred the Unready is ready. He says that McDonnell should play the bishop to f5 because it takes it out of danger at a critical point several moves down the line. So let's see how this works out. Ethelred's plan is quite complicated, but let's go through it quickly. King to h2, it can't do much else, and then you push b4. And then after captures, you push your other pawn, and after captures here, labourdonnais is giving up the bishop because he is going to win the pawn race across to the other side. But the critical point is that because of the bishop to f5 move, labourdonnais cannot now deliver a check and then pick up the bishop on e6 because the bishop is safely out of the way on b5. So very nice from Ethelred. Ethelred says that from here, what's going to happen is the queen is going to keep checking the king, and the king is just going to keep delaying matters until such a point as white runs out of checks. And now from here, according to Ethelred, what you do is you give your people concessions so that they're willing to support you again, and whilst the Danes think that you are still weak, you join the Norwegians and launch an expedition with the Icelanders against King Canute. And now notice King Canute is spelt C-N-U-T, not any other spelling. And what you do is you attack London Bridge with ships and retake London and other parts of the country, and you force Canute to leave England, then take revenge on his allies that are left behind. So here we are, this is the last ally coming across the board, and it's going to be an inevitable checkmate rather quickly with your allies from Norway. So very nice from Ethelred. However, a critical flaw in this plan is that labourdonnais is not a Dane, he's actually French, and this plan is just way too complicated for poor old McDonnell. So let's just rewind things to the position that we were in. Instead of this amazing, I have to say, amazing move from Ethelred, bishop to f5, Instead of this, McDonnell plays b4 straight away, and now the game is not going to go so well for him. So the next few moves are as we saw before. The pawn captures the pawn, the wing pawn is pushed, the pawn is captured on the wing, and labourdonnais gives up the bishop because he knows he's going to win the pawn race. He starts pushing the pawn. The king moves out of the way, this time to d2, the pawn keeps going, and here McDonnell spots that if the pawn queens, it's coming in with a check and it's capturing the bishop, which didn't move to f5 as Ethelred wanted. So, to try to defend, McDonnell brings it to d5 instead. Now, labourdonnais can't push his b-pawn because the bishop will capture it, so he pushes his e-pawn instead. And you'll notice that if the bishop captures this one, it takes away from the defense of the b-pawn. So instead, McDonnell decides to race for the border himself. And here we go, they both race towards the border, and labourdonnais makes it first. Now, this move is actually move 80. This is the longest game we've seen since match 3, game 1. Actually, it was the longest game in this series. It had 99 moves. McDonnell ended up winning it. Let's see if this game beats 99 moves. Labourdonnais decides he's going to take out the wing pawn because it's just far too dangerous, and McDonnell comes in with a check, so the king backs off. It's a check from the bishop now, the king backs off again, and McDonnell is going to try to pick off the remaining white pawns, giving checks if he can. So he comes across to b1, which forks the king and the pawn, and so the king moves aside. He doesn't pick up the pawn straight away though, he checks again, and the king backs off to f6. This gives McDonnell a chance to pick up the pawn whilst delivering another check. Labourdonnais blocks with his queen, so McDonnell comes to d8 for another check, and the king backs off. And here McDonnell plays his bishop up to d5 to attack the queen. It's not check this time, but the white queen has no checks on the black king, so all Labourdonnais can do is defend. He backs off and offers a queen exchange, which McDonnell refuses. He gives another check, and the king backs off again. Now here McDonnell plays king to e2, and labourdonnais takes the chance to start pushing his wing pawn. McDonnell just brings his bishop down to e4, eyeing up the h7 square, and labourdonnais keeps pushing. But McDonnell comes in for a check on h7, the king moves aside. The queen comes back to g8, gives another check, and the king returns to h6. And it was here that they both agreed to a draw. So this wasn't quite the longest game, it was 93 moves, and match 3, game 1 retains its title with the longest game at 99 moves. This match number 4 is still 1-0 to labourdonnais. They'll play again in game 3 with the same colour pieces. So why did they agree to a draw? Well, you can see that if you do queen to h7, you're just going to repeat the same moves again and again, which they both foresaw and correctly agreed to a draw. So that's it. Before we say goodbye to Ethelred the Unready, we'll just finish his story. We all know that Canute reconquered England eventually, and it didn't turn out too well for Ethelred. But for now, it's a draw, and Ethelred is quite happy with that. I'll see you again next time.